Price elasticity is another basic economic principle which informs us on whether our price control measures, our taxing measures, will actually impact whether someone will keep purchasing a psychoactive substance or whether they'll actually stop using a psychoactive substance to any significant degree. So here's what we know. Here's the basic background. We know that taxes and other measures will artificially increase the price of a consumer good. So basically, we're trying to get rid of that supply and demand equation. If they're raised enough, we do know that the prevalence of consumption for a product will go down, regardless of what that product is, whether it's a non-psychoactive substance, whether it's a psychoactive substance, or just kind of a general product. And again, what this price elasticity does is allows us to predict how much that consumption will change. So what is it? It's actually the sensitivity of the consumer to changes in price. And it's actually a relatively simple equation. It's simply the percent change in quantity demand over the percent change in price. And a product is considered elastic when consumers are very sensitive to price changes. So a small increase or a small decrease in price will significantly increase or decrease the amount of product that is purchased. A product is considered inelastic when consumers don't really care. You can change the price dramatically, but people will still purchase or people will still not purchase, depending on what the case is. So how do we actually define elasticity? Well, we use the cutoffs of 1 and -1. If the elasticity is greater than 1 or less than -1, we consider the product relatively elastic. We consider the consumers to be very sensitive to the price of those products. If it's between those numbers, if it's between -1 and 1, we consider it relatively inelastic, where consumers aren't that sensitive to changes in price. And these simple cartoons kind of demonstrate that. Large prices in soda might get people to stop purchasing and drinking soda. But we often think that we need something like milk. That's more of a need, a necessity, than something like soda might be. So here's a brief example. So let's assume that there's a 1% increase in the price on alcohol, whatever alcoholic beverage there is, a 1% increase in price. And if we increase the price of this beverage by 1%, we assume that there is a 0.5% drop in consumption. So our percent change in price is 1%, that's our denominator. Our percent change in the quantity demanded is negative 0.5%, which is our numerator. It's negative because there was a drop in consumption. Theoretically, it could be a positive number if you increased price, but in this case, it's a negative number. And when we plug it into the equation, again, it's relatively straightforward. It's simply negative 0.5 divided by 1, which gives us a price elasticity of negative 0.5. So in this hypothetical example, we would consider this alcoholic beverage to be price inelastic because we don't have a large change in consumer consumption based on this increase in price. So, are substances elastic or inelastic? Now, the last slide, that was a hypothetical example, but what happens if we bring it into the real world? Well, alcohol is actually relatively inelastic, whether it's all combined or whether we actually differentiate between different types of alcohol. We find price elasticities of between about 0.1 to 0.3 or 0.4 at most. And we see prices among heavy drinkers, or elasticities among heavy drinkers, to be almost zero. So there's almost no price elasticity among different alcoholic beverages. Now, tobacco is a little bit more interesting, a little bit more complicated. Among adults, tobacco is pretty inelastic. It's about the same as alcohol. You see numbers about 0.4, 0.5, up to 0.8 in some developing countries like India. India is a developing country. It's kind of a middle ground depending on what state, but I'll keep it in there. But among youth, tobacco is highly elastic. We have elasticities of negative 1.5 for multiple income countries. We have elasticities of negative 2.2, which is amazingly elastic for low and middle income countries in another study. So for tobacco, it depends on what age population that's being targeted. There is also some research, although not nearly as much, on the price elasticity for illicit substances. Heroin seems to be somewhat inelastic. It's just kind of below that border of negative zero point 0.1 at an elasticity of negative 0.8. Methamphetamine, another study that was done, is considered inelastic. We see elasticity is a 0.1 to 0.3. Again, very close to zero, so we consider that. The consumers are not sensitive to price changes if they're interested in methamphetamine. So what does it all mean? Why are these price elasticities important? Well, they mean that if we're going to tax something or we're going to artificially increase the price of something, we need relatively large increases in taxes, relatively large increases in prices to see a substantial change in the prevalence of consumption among adults. So if we want to see a 5% reduction in the use of alcohol, we need to find a way to increase the price of alcohol by about 10% if the elasticity is negative 0.5, like in our hypothetical example. Now, in the real world, the price elasticity is actually even lower, or in this case, higher, I guess. It's about negative 1 to negative 0.1 to negative 0.4. So we may have to increase the price by 20, 30, 40% to see a reduced consumption by 5 or 10%. So we do need relatively large increases to actually have public health impact. However, among youth, because the elasticities are much higher, particularly for tobacco, even small changes are likely to significantly decrease youth substance use.